This is Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills, that's me, where we present clear thinking on confusing topics in challenging times. And that was the sound of activists showing up at a reading of the anti-fascist play, It Can't Happen Here. This play was read by some local politicians from the Santa Cruz, California area. Congressman Jimmy Panetta, Santa Cruz Mayor Fred Keeley, City Council Member Martine Watkins, and others at a Bookshop Santa Cruz sponsored event that was then interrupted by protesters both banging drums on the outside of the theater and also speaking up from inside of the theater and even approaching the stage. One of the protesters, Hector Marin, who ran for city council this past spring, describes the situation from the protester side.
This protest occurred at the 418 Project, and we were protesting both Jimmy Panetta and Fred Keeley, who were going to do this reading against fascism. And with the main purpose of this protest, it was basically a statement from the community, from the unhoused, from the students, from the youth, from the community members, from the pro-Palestinian activists that were basically telling these state actors that fascism is already here. They were trying to do a reading saying that MAGA Republicans were the fascists, but we were over here telling them that they're the ones who are reinforcing this oppression by not supporting a ceasefire and by not divesting from Israel with our taxpayer money. And with what happened is that Fred Keeley arrived. He was trying to not engage with this group of protesters. I swayed him to talk to us, talk to his constituents. And right when we were demanding action and accountability on his part, and this was a group of students, women of color, and the unhoused community members were there pressing on him. When things got too real for him, he walked away. So the protest kept on going on. We kept on doing our chants. There were people that were plugging their ears because it was, quote unquote, too loud. There were people that were mocking us, saying that they were going to go in regardless, but we were still keeping up the pressure. We went in both ways, both from the front and the back, to make sure that we were heard. And from the videos, you can hear us protesting in the backgrounds. So we were definitely heard. And with what happened is that Jimmy Panetta and the crew zoomed out at the end without engaging their constituents at all whatsoever to go into the safety. And that's unfortunate because we put forth this effort to engage with them only to be met with such blatant disregard. And this entire action was really inspiring to see because we marched from the 418 Project towards Bookshop Santa Cruz, and we kept the pressure up when they were doing the signings of this book of fascism. And we were basically telling these people that we will not be silent in the midst of genocide. 40,000 casualties have occurred. And not only is a ceasefire still being called from the community, but we are calling for a halt in the weapons of arms of Israel, of this act of genocide that is ongoing from our state. And that's what we can do at a local level. And hopefully we can keep the pressure up to ensure that we hold these politicians accountable to their word.
That was Hector Marin, who ran for city council this past spring and joined a protest group at a reading of an anti-fascist play by several local politicos. Just last week, also, another group of protesters spent a week in vigil just outside of Panetta's offices at the Santa Cruz County building to protest Panetta's acceptance of major donations from AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby, and his votes to condemn international court charges of genocide by Israel and his vote to ban Gaza Health Ministry death toll figures in Congress. There's a lot going on with this issue. Here at Moment of Truth, we have interviewed Palestinians, Jewish protesters for Palestine, Jewish dialogue facilitators, student encampment protesters, student arrestees, and more. And I will link to all of these past shows in our show notes for this episode at our show page at ksqd.org. Despite all of these interviews, actually, we still have questions. And we thought it might be good to cut through some of the understandable and very high emotions around this issue and get down to some brass tacks. We want to learn more about the history of the region, about the current situation, about what a Harris administration might do, and what a Trump administration might do about this deadly war that threatens now to engulf the region, and about the California Central Coast congressional representative Jimmy Panetta and how he has responded or not to his constituents on this issue. To be fair, we did send an email to Panetta's office asking for a reply or a statement because we said we would cover this protest and we have heard nothing back. We have in our studio today Stephen Zunes. Stephen Zunes is founder of the Middle Eastern Studies program at University of San Francisco and author of Tinderbox, U.S. Middle East Policy and the Roots of Terrorism, as well as several other books and a wide range of articles, including a very recent article for The Progressive on what a Harris-Walz administration might do about the ongoing war in Israel, the escalation of the war, and the ongoing devastation, mass killing in Gaza, starvation, infection, and more, not to mention all of the October 7th hostages who are still in Gaza, political prisoners in Israeli prisons, protests in Israel, and on and on. Recognized as one of the country's leading scholars of U.S. Middle East policy and strategic nonviolent action, Professor Zunes serves as a senior policy analyst for the Foreign Policy in Focus project of the Institute for Policy Studies, an associate editor of Peace Review, and until recently was a contributing editor to Tikkun. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we are going to ask you something very challenging, which is to try to help us get a lay of the land for the region, because although people are very upset about this issue, they're coming from all sides with a lot of emotion. I think it's important to really know what the facts on the ground are. And so let's go back to pre-1948 to the beginning of the Zionist movement. But actually, let's even go back before then to because a lot of Jewish people or Israeli people or Zionists will say, but we've been there forever. This is like our ancestral homeland. And can you speak to the facts on the ground about that?
Well, certainly. Thousands of years ago, there were Jewish kingdoms in the area that we now know as Israel and Palestine. The modern Israelis, we of course had the Roman conquest and the forced diaspora of the Jews from Palestine. Over the centuries, a small Jewish community emerged in Palestine, as there were in other Arab countries. But it wasn't until the late 19th, early 20th century that you had this movement known as Zionism, to create a Jewish nation state in the approximate lands of the old Jewish kingdoms. I mean, the irony, of course, is that if you did a DNA test, you'd probably find at least as many Palestinian Arabs who were direct descendants of the original Israelites as you would Israelis. I mean, we're talking thousands of years of diaspora. Obviously, there was intermarriage, there was conversion, there's all sorts of things. People change religions. And generally, it's not considered in international law a people's right to conquer a land that they claim that some co-religionist occupied, thousands of years ago. In addition to the Jewish kingdoms, I mean, there were Canaanites, Philistines, Moabites, Phoenicians. I mean, there are other indigenous peoples of those regions as well. And this kind of exclusive claim that therefore, we get, because we are Jewish, we can therefore take this land and dominate the other population through ethnic cleansing, through occupation, through denial of equal rights. Again, there's no basis in international law that would accept that. Mm-hmm. The broader question, of course, is Zionism a national liberation movement of an oppressed people, and like other oppressed peoples, the nation state, at least for periods in the 19th, 20th century, was seen as a way which people could assert their identity and maintain their culture, their institutions, and the like. Or is it a colonial settler movement of this largely initially European-based movement that did end up conquering and suppressing the indigenous Palestinian population that had been there again, as at least as far back as the original Jews there.
Right, and not totally suppressing necessarily, because here we're still, we had the attack of October 7th,
So my basic answer, someone as a historian and a political scientist specializing in the region, is that both are true. Mm-hmm. Zionism is a national liberation movement for Jews, and it is a colonial settler movement. And the big struggle has been, can you consolidate? Can you is it possible, to have a Jewish nation state without discriminating. And there were hopes for a two-state solution for a long, long time, but the direction the Zionist movement has under the leadership of the far right in Israel, which has been gaining ascendancy, is it seems less and less likely that they are willing to compromise, that they're willing to share the land. They quite explicitly rejected the idea of Palestinian statehood. They've shown no qualms about killing tens of thousands of civilians, of imposing an apartheid-type system in the occupied territories. And so when people ask me, my perspective on it, I'm not Zionist, I'm not anti-Zionist, but I do believe that Israel, no more or less than any other country, is bound by certain standards of international law and human rights, no more or less than any other country, and that it's fine to support the rights of Israeli Jews, but it's not right to do so at the expense of other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're talking to Stephen Zunes, who is the author of Tinderbox, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Roots of Terrorism in the Middle East. And you are listening to KSQD 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5. We're taking a deep dive into the history of Israel-Palestine and the whole region and talking about, is Israel a colonial state, or is it a state that was set up as a move to create independence and freedom from oppression for a group of people? And both. I mean, that's what I was thinking when you were talking is, I have been to some of the student protests. I've listened to some of the workshops, and there is this presentation of this is a settler colonial state. But then, I would say, well, hang on, it's not like just Jewish people came in from nowhere. There was a history, there was a context happening, and that was World War II.
Yes. But the thing is, of course, when you talk about it, about the Holocaust and World War II, it's like the Jews jumping out of the burning building. That was Europe, and then landing on top of the Palestinians. Right. And the big critique of Zionism is, why should Palestinians suffer for the sins of Europeans? Right. Indeed, if you look historically, there's far less anti-Jewish oppression, far less anti-Semitism in the Arab and Islamic world than there was in the Christian European world. Yeah. And that, But also, I think a lot of younger people, including a lot of younger Jews, are questioning Zionism right now. Part of it is they're questioning the nature of the nation state. The nation state, nationalism is a fairly modern and I think temporary phenomenon. It used to be seen that and people in my generation saw national liberation struggles, for example, in the global South, fighting colonialism, imperialism, and neocolonialism, and the like, as a progressive force. Younger people see nationalism like maybe Eastern Europe, a more reactionary kind of force. And frankly, Zionism under its current leadership, the people, Netanyahu and his government, and AIPAC and their allies in the U.S. government, frankly, are much more akin to Orban and Putin and these more racist
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump, these more racist kind of nationalists with authoritarian kind of streak, and that's why a lot of people, are now calling themselves post-Zionist, that they could understand why Zionism existed. It was created. Yeah. They can understand that they realize that over these generations, that a unique Israeli culture has developed, and you cannot deny that they are a nation. Yes. They identify as such, but the question is, given the failure to create a two-state solution where both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs could have two independent, secure nation-states side by side, should we now be talking about a binational state, a democratic secular state, or something that would guarantee equal rights to both peoples, but not necessarily with two states?
Something has to change. What's happening now is absolute madness, it seems to me. And I do want to give the call-in number. We are going over sort of the history of Israel-Palestine with Professor Stephen Zunes, who's an expert in this field, founded the Middle Eastern Studies Department at the University of San Francisco. If you want to call in, we're going to go over the history a little bit, so we might put you on hold for a few minutes. But feel free to call in at 831-900-5773, 831-900-5773, or you can email us a question at onair@ksqd.org. We're having a conversation trying to, sort of cut through all of the emotion, which is totally understandable. People have lost family members. People are losing family members. People are afraid of losing family members. People are in Israel. I mean, the people in Israel and Gaza, in Gaza, they are devastated at this point. I mean, I think it's like 85% of the population has been displaced in Gaza. That is out of 2 million. So that's huge. But let's go back to the more recent history. So when Zionism really started to move, the actual percentage of Jewish people, I believe, was like 10% of the region. And Palestinians were 90%, or was it mixed? Or
and the Jewish immigration grew. That's about the time of the United Nations partitioned Palestine. The Jewish population was close to 30%. They own less than 10% of the land because they're more based in the urban areas. And yet the UN gave the new state of Israel 54% of the land. Indeed, the majority of the land they gave to Israel was populated by Palestinians. And the Palestinians, rejected the idea of dividing their country up like that. They were willing to live alongside Jews, but didn't want to see them take over half their country. And you had what the Israelis call the Israeli War of Independence. The Palestinians called the Nakba, the catastrophe, where Israel ended up conquering 78% of the territory and ethnically cleansing the vast majority of the indigenous Palestinian population, leaving what we now call the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So for years, people have been saying, well, at least the Palestinians should have a state on the West Bank and Gaza Strip. But Israel, which conquered the rest of that territory in the 1967 war, has refused to allow that. There was some progress about in around 2000 when Ehud Barak, promised offered the Palestinians about 80% of the West Bank, but it would have been divided into 4 non-contiguous cantons, and Israel would still control the water or the airspace, the movement between the different parts of the Palestinian enclaves. They couldn't, and Israel would have control all the borders with neighboring countries. It was far short of a viable independent state. So,
are we talking about the Oslo Accords now?
Yes.
Because you've been talking about Netanyahu and his government, which has been a decade or more, decades perhaps.
In fact, he was first prime minister in the 90s.
Wow. Okay. So it's been a while, but before that, there was possibly some hope. And I guess I'm wondering, because I've read about the Oslo Accords, and if you go in and read the history of the 6-Day War, the 1967 war, there are all these different perspectives, and a lot of times the imperialist colonial powers, the United States, the UK, they all had a stake in what was happening, whether it was about the Suez Canal. There's a lot of pressure also, right, from outside nations. So it's very messy, actually, when you take it. It's not just like, all of a sudden Israel was attacked, or all of a sudden Israel grabbed a bunch. It seems messy.
Oh, very much so. I mean, the U.S. was supporting Israel during the Cold War. The Soviets were supporting Egypt and Syria during that period. Egypt switched sides and made a peace deal with the help of the United States with Israel. But the Palestine question has remained unresolved. The Oslo Accords in 1993 gave a process where that 22% remaining of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, could perhaps become a state. But again, Israel, you had a combination of Israeli settlers moving into the West Bank. These are colonists, and it's illegal under international law for any country to transport any part of its civilian population onto occupied territory. But these settlements were surrounding the Palestinian population centers, making a viable contiguous state nearly impossible. And And meanwhile,
and so basically, just to give people a picture, a lot of Palestinians live in East Jerusalem and used to be able to travel into other parts of the West Bank.
Israel illegally annexed East Jerusalem and surrounding areas.
Okay.
And basically, there are checkpoints everywhere. You can't go from one town to another. It still has a feel of an occupied territory, even though the Oslo Agreement did give the Palestine Authority, the moderate coalition of secular Palestinian nationalist groups, control of the major urban areas. But because it looked like a viable state was less likely, the repression was continuing, the colonization was continued. You had extremist groups like Hamas spring up, and you started to have terrorism, increased the amount of terrorism attacking Israel. Of course, that made Israel even more hardline, less likely to compromise. And throughout this, the United States so we are the sole mediator. The United Nations should not get involved anymore. It's just up to us. And the United States is, as everybody knows, is the world's #1 military, economic, and diplomatic supporter of Israel. Now, you cannot be an objective mediator if you are a huge supporter of the other side, of one side, the stronger side, the more powerful side.
Now, I want to ask you about this because this is a question that's been on my mind, right? Okay, so we support Saudi Arabia in some respects, and we were trying to support this peace process with Saudi Arabia and Netanyahu. And we may have shakier relations. We support Egypt, actually. Egypt, we give a huge amount of funding to, second only to Israel, actually, as from what I've seen. And I want to ask you why. What strategically, I mean, maybe I said this is a dumb question for people, and maybe people know, but I'm like, well, I know that there's a sense of guilt and remorse from not really responding to the Holocaust, especially when it was first starting, when Jewish people were trying to come to this country and being literally turned away. We had Nazis here, like we still do. We had like Congress people, in the Nazi pocket, here in the United States. And we've had our own, sort of apartheid state here in the United States. So we certainly, it's not like we were so terribly opposed to these things, but strategically, people have talked about, they want to build another canal like the Suez Canal through Gaza, or there's oil fields.
No.
Okay.
It's. I mean, basically, the United States supports Israel the same reason we support Saudi Arabia and Egypt, the way we support other right-wing governments that violate human rights and international norms. Is seen as in our strategic interest. In fact, Israel's particularly important because these Arab dictatorships can be overthrown, a coup, a revolution, but Israel's there to stay. Israel is, in the words of one of our former Secretary of States, our unsinkable aircraft carrier. Biden himself has said on repeated occasions that if it weren't for Israel, we'd have to invent them because we need to have this strategic ally in this region. I mean, Israel itself doesn't have oil, but obviously it's near many countries that do. And they're a great ally against Iran and other challenges. They have helped crush radical nationalist and Islamist movements, not just in Palestine, but in Lebanon and Jordan and elsewhere. They have supported U.S. allies around the world with military equipment. They even shipped military equipment to governments and movements the United States wanted to support but couldn't for political reasons, like apartheid South Africa, the Nicaraguan Contras, the Guatemalan junta. More recently, Colombian paramilitaries and the and Kurdish, some Kurdish groups. They are battlefield testing for American weapons. They've trained American forces in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism tactics in Iraq and elsewhere.
And our own police force.
Oh, yeah, yes, exactly. So it's very much a strategic issue. It's not... and I think, frankly, the role of AIPAC has been greatly exaggerated. I think it's AIPAC has made it more difficult to challenge U.S. policy. AIPAC if it weren't for AIPAC, we'd have more allies in Congress. If it weren't for AIPAC, there'd be less censorship and there'd be more debate. But the overall thrust of U.S. policy would be the same. I mean, think of all we've supported genocidal allies committing genocide in Guatemala and Bangladesh and East Timor and Turkish Kurdistan, most recently Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Yeah. These are genocidal wars. We supported Indonesia's occupation of East Timor, which massacred a third of that island nation's population. We vetoed Security Council resolutions against apartheid South Africa's occupation of Namibia. To this day, we support Morocco's illegal occupation of Western Sahara. In fact, we've even formally recognized their illegal annexation. So Israel's not unique in this way, And so this idea that if it weren't for AIPAC, the United States would suddenly be concerned about human rights and international law in the Middle East. I mean, let's be honest. When has the United States supported those principles anywhere? When an ally is...
This is interesting as you're saying it, because one of the biggest complaints from Israelis and people who feel that this is sort of anti-Semitic, this intense focus on Gaza and what's happening in Gaza, and also to a lesser extent, I'd say, in the West Bank now, that why aren't we talking about Sudan? Why aren't we talking about the Congo? And as you're speaking, I'm like, yeah, why aren't we? Actually,
well, the reason is that the United States isn't supporting the killing in Sudan. We're not arming the people. We're not vetoing UN Security Council resolutions trying to stop it. We're not attacking the International Criminal Court for indicting Sudanese warlords. We're not attacking the International Court of Justice for recognizing the illegality of what's going on. The same reason. It's kind of like, why do you complain about during the Cold War when you talk about U.S. support of these horrible right-wing regimes? Why don't you criticize oppression in communist countries? Because we're not supporting that repression there. As Americans, we have a particular responsibility, I believe, to speak out against our to focus on countries supported by the United States, because we're making that oppression possible. I mean, I've certainly signed innumerable petitions about political prisoners in Iran and Syria and things like that. It's not like we can't do anything about repression elsewhere, or not. We certainly should do what we can in these other issues. But realistically speaking, we have a much greater obligation when our corporations and our government are making possible the imposition of the apartheid system on the West Bank, and we are supporting a war that is. That the human rights abuses, the war crimes are so severe that they do indeed legally meet the international legal definition of genocide. Yeah, we deserve this kind of special attention on Israel. And
genocide, I think a lot of people think that genocide means you wipe out a whole people.
No.
It can be a partial wipe out.
Yes. Genocide is one of those rare words where the popular definition, the legal definition, is actually broader than the popular definition. In that case, I gave these other examples of Guatemala in the 1980s against the indigenous population. Turkey and Iraq against their Kurdish populations, and the 35 years ago, Indonesia, East Timor, et cetera. So no, this is not comparing it to the Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust really is singular, and I think it's very wrong to make comparisons in that regard. But yes, what Israel is doing is clear violation of the Genocide Treaty, and there's a broad international consensus about that.
We are talking to Stephen Zunes, who is the author of Tinderbox and founded the Middle Eastern Studies Department at the University of San Francisco. We welcome your calls and emails. I'll give out the info right after this short break.
KSQD thanks GPI Builders for supporting this program. GPI Builders is a locally owned and operated full-service construction company with more than 10 years of experience and expertise. GPI Builders specializes in home additions, ADUs, and residential remodels throughout the Bay Area. For more information, 1-800-916-8343 or gpibuilders.com. Thank you, GPI Builders, for supporting community radio, K-Squid.
This is Amy Chen Mills with Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills on KSQD. We are talking with Stephen Zunes, who is a professor and founder of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of San Francisco, author of several books. But let's just catch up to ourselves. So we were talking about the biblical history almost, and then the sort of the Zionist movement, and understandably, Jews looking for a place to be where they could protect themselves and not have to rely on anybody because they had been let down many, many times in many, many countries, in very tragic ways, and Holocaust certainly not the least of those ways. And then we got to like when Rabin was assassinated, and who stepped in after Rabin? Was it Netanyahu? No, who?
It was Shimon Peres. But then
wait, who was it again? We missed
Shimon Peres.
Shimon Peres.
Yeah,
okay.
he was also a Labor Party official, but the elections that soon followed ended up bringing Netanyahu in power.
Yeah. And it's really been sort of far right since then.
No, there's some breaks.
Some breaks.
Ehud Barak briefly in the early 2000s, and there was a coalition government recently. But the problem, of course, is that Israel's politics have moved more and more to the right, while American Jews are moving to the left.
Okay,
when it comes on Israel and Palestine, Israeli Jews have been moving more and more to the right, in part because the United States has given them a blank check. Basically, they don't have to have the consequences of their actions because U.S. will veto, any kind of UN effort to force Israel to comply with international law. We give them unconditional military aid. So a lot of Israelis figure, okay, we might as well vote for the right because we don't have to deal with any consequences. And indeed, that's why. That's what Netanyahu said. Just about a year ago, we can ignore the Palestinians. We got it made. We can keep building settlements. U.S. isn't going to stop us. We can do what we want. We can ignore them. Well, right. October 7th was a desperate cry saying, no, you cannot ignore us.
Right.
You have to deal with the Palestinians.
And it was awful, and it was horrific, and it was terrible. And when I look at the history of this region, there have been attacks on villages by Israelis.
Yeah, Israel has killed far more civilians than Palestinians have. But the thing is that occupation can never occupation, denial of statehood can never justify terrorism. But terrorism can never justify the denial of statehood and occupation. And similarly, that Israel, like any country, has a right to self-defense, but no country has a right to slaughter civilians by the tens of thousands, as Israel has been doing.
Yeah, we have to get to the most important thing that we're all thinking about right now in the United States. Who do we vote for? Mm-hmm. If we're and I've seen so many conflicting views on do we vote for Harris or do we at least say that we're going to go vote for Stein or Cornel West or even, RFK Jr. actually doesn't have a different policy than Biden on Israel. But I guess I'm wondering, so you have just written an article in the Progressive magazine with a pretty nuanced analysis of what you think Kamala Harris might do. I myself heard her speak, and I thought she's a little, I could sense in her voice just this like a little more hardline stance with Netanyahu and with Israel. But what do you think?
Well, first of all, Biden has been very extreme. He's been very much an outlier in the international community, and casting the only vote and thereby vetoing otherwise unanimous Security Council resolutions. One of only 9 countries in the 193-member UN Security Council to vote against a ceasefire. Rejecting calls to condition military aid. He very much is an extremist.
Okay,
he is like Reagan in Central America.
Yeah, okay, wow, that's crazy.
But for him, it's just not about AIPAC either. He really believes that strategic relationship. But he's also this and this is where Kamala Harris comes in.
Yeah,
Biden's that immediate post-war generation of liberals that has this kind of romantic view of Israel, like Paul Newman in Exodus, the brave pioneers bringing democracy and freedom to this backward land, making the desert bloom. It kind of reminds me of the 1930s communists. They did great work here in the United States in civil rights and labor, but they really believe that Uncle Joe Stalin was creating this ideal socialist thing. And even some leftists today who are rationalizing for what Ortega or Maduro Maduro is doing. It's the same kind of phenomenon that you want to believe in something so much, whether it be socialism or Zionism or whatever, that you are unwilling to see the reality on the ground. You are fighting for what you think something is or what it should be rather than it actually is. And so that's where Biden comes from. Harris is of a younger generation. She's a woman of color. She therefore sees a little more nuance in the situation. Her voting record in Senate was pretty bad, to be honest. I mean, she was pretty hardline in her support. But a lot of junior senators just kind of follow the lead of the party leadership. And Elizabeth Warren, her first few votes and statements on Israel were pretty bad, but within a couple of years, she next to Bernie, was probably the most progressive senator on Capitol Hill on this issue. And I think Harris has shifted somewhat as well. The problem is that she is a sitting vice president. It's really hard for a sitting vice president to become president. Only 4 have tried it since the early 19th century, and 3 of them lost. And part of the reason is that you want to assert your own agenda, but you can't openly split with your president. It would be seen as disloyal. It would create all sorts of divisions. It really can't be done. That was Hubert Humphrey's dilemma back in 1968,
right.
And, narrowly losing to Nixon as a result over Vietnam.
Because he was Johnson's vice president.
Exactly.
Right, and Johnson wasn't willing to stop bombing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, but all indications are that Harris would take a much tougher line towards Netanyahu. From both my contacts within D.C. as well as a number of press leaks, it's pretty clear that within the Biden administration, the really hardline, pro-Netanyahu people are Secretary of State Blinken, NSC Middle East point man McGurk, and National Security Advisor Sullivan. On the other side, pushing for more compromise, have been Secretary of Defense Austin, CIA Director Burns, and Vice President Harris. She's really been pushing for a ceasefire. She's the first administration official to call for a ceasefire. She has really pressed the civilian the civilian casualties. So I really think there would be a shift. So, those of you who know my writing and have heard me on the radio before know I've made a career of attacking Democrats who do not live up to the basic liberal standards about human rights and international law. I'm willing to give them a really, really hard time. But I'm actually encouraging people to give Kamala Harris a little slack in this case, both because of what's at stake in terms of the election. I don't want people in swing states to get so cynical that they will vote third party or not vote, but also that I really do think that she is actually more progressive on this issue than she can say publicly.
Yeah, and you have said she will not switch. You're not going to see a big switch from her before she gets elected.
Exactly.
And probably not even right away either. She probably would think that through quite a bit. But then on the other hand, you have people dying almost daily, right? And so I guess, okay, so what's the alternative? So people then, let's say in Michigan and in Georgia and in these swing states like Arizona and Nevada, if they are progressive, if they are left and they decide we're not going to vote for Harris, we're going to vote for Jill Stein if she's even on the ballot, because she's not on the ballot in all 50 states and was missing like 20 of them at least. Cornel West is not on the ballot in all 50 states. I don't see a path to victory for these folks. RFK Jr. also not on the ballot and doing some weird shenanigans to try to get on the ballot, a lot of fake signatures and so forth, with help from the Republicans. So what do you think? What would Trump do? I mean, do you think any of these third-party candidates have a chance?
No. It's just not. I mean, unfortunately, in our system, it really is a wasted vote. I mean, personally, if Biden was a nominee, in fact, I live in California, which is going to win by millions of votes. I personally would probably vote for Cornel West. At this point, I'm excited enough about Harris that I might actually vote Democratic this year. And I would certainly encourage people in swing states to do so. I think Rebecca Solnit says it really well. She says that voting is a chess move, not a Valentine. That we really do need to think strategically. And I feel the emotion. Oh, my God, I feel the emotion. I've lost friends. I mean, this has been tearing me up this past 10 months.
Yeah, it's been
I am
really
so
intense.
angry. I mean, I find myself muttering to myself like an old man or whatever, just thinking about the betrayal of these of Democrats to, I don't expect Democrats to be socialist or left wing or as radical as I am on most issues, but I at least expect them to uphold basic basic principles of international law. I mean, we agreed on all those back in the late 1940s, and they're betraying these left and right. So, I got a lot of feelings up about this, and I don't blame people for having a lot of feelings up. But again, we need to think strategically when it comes to voting. We really do.
Yeah, and so let's talk about Donald Trump then. When he was in office, he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. My understanding is that he sort of gave the green light to the settlements, which is really where, if there were to be a two-state solution, it would be in the West Bank and Gaza. And so when you're settling it, that doesn't seem like a really good sign.
Yeah, he formally recognized these settlements as part of Israel. He opposes Palestinian statehood. He actually recognized Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan Heights, which Israel seized from Syria in 1967. He's very, very much an extremist. He would support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. He would support even worse things. I mean, his anti-Muslim, anti-Arab bigotry is quite well known. What's disturbing, of course, is that Biden has upheld these Trump decisions of keeping the embassy there, closing down the Palestinian consulate in East Jerusalem, continuing to recognize Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan. But Trump will be far, far worse for Palestine, not to mention pretty much everything else.
Yeah, I mean, and there was the Muslim ban, which was, to really it tore families apart. People had husbands and wives who could not come see them, come be with them, children and parents and so on. And I guess what I'm wondering is, so now there's this sort of expansion of this conflict with, Israel assassinating someone inside of Iran. Hezbollah has been bombing the north side of Israel. Hezbollah is backed by Iran. And there's a sense, I think, probably amongst a lot of Israelis that this is scary. We need support. And I keep wondering, but isn't this also because of Gaza?
Certainly. Certainly, the Hezbollah attacks were there's been relative peace on that northern border for ever since Israel withdrew its occupation forces from southern Lebanon in 2000, and then of course there was the Israeli invasion in 2006. Once they pulled back from that, there'd been relative calm subsequently, and this is very much in response. And it's very. I mean, the fact that the United States is supporting Israel in this ongoing genocidal war, the fact that many Western governments are quietly supporting Israel as well, the fact that the Arab governments have not been able to do anything to stop it, this leads these extremist governments and movements like Iran and like its allies to try to take advantage of the situation. See, we're doing something. Even if it's lobbing some rockets to do relatively little harm. Relatively little damage, but it keeps Israel on edge. Of course, the Houthis attacking shipping in the Red Sea, and it's a very dangerous game of brinkmanship. I don't think the Iranians want a full-scale war. They're reaping the political benefits by keeping it low key.
Do you think the United States does? Because I heard that actually the United States was talking behind the scenes to Iran at one point, saying, "Let's keep this, kind of symbolic."
And the U.S. is trying to, I think, curb Israel from doing so as well. But we have a mixed message. On the one hand, we say, Israel, you shouldn't provoke Iran by, assassinating, people and making attacks on Iran itself and on Iranian embassy in Syria and these things like that. But then we'll bring in these carrier groups and additional troops and weapons to defend Israel in case Iran does retaliate. And so we're giving mixed messages there.
And we're saying we're going to support the civilians in Gaza. We're going to send aid. We're going to drop these packages on them,
Yeah.
And then at the same time, we're sending every few months, we're sending another shipment of bombs.
Yes. And again, and the thing is, the Biden administration and Congress, there's no issue really out there where there's such a gap between public opinion and U.S. policy. The majority of Americans believe U.S. should impose a ceasefire, force Israel to come
to the table,
to stop the bombing. Hamas has agreed to release the hostages in return for Israel withdrawing from Gaza and stopping the bombing. And hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been demonstrating on the streets demanding that. The majority of Americans want that. But Biden, just today, are saying, we have basically we've altered proposal to meet more of what Israel's wanting, and so now if Hamas rejects it after already accepting, it's their fault, even though we shifted the terms more to Israel's favor. And so
I have to ask you, is this about also the defense industry? Because I was thinking,
big
like,
time.
We give them $3 billion. They turn around, they buy weapons from, like, I don't know, BAE or Lockheed Martin.
People say, we're giving $20 billion of aid to Israel, and how much of that is per Israeli man, woman, and child? Why don't we use that money for what we need here in the United States? But the fact is that over 80% of all so-called U.S. aid to Israel goes to American arms manufacturers. This is we're not giving money to ordinary Israelis. And
so it's a perfect cycle.
Oh, yeah, very
for
much.
Lockheed Martin,
exactly,
and BAE, and whoever. I mean,
they're more powerful than AIPAC. If you look in terms of their lobbying budgets, in terms of their political action committees, they're bigger than AIPAC.
And I have to say, Panetta takes a lot of that money.
Oh yeah, very much so. And so and then on top of that, of course, you have the right-wing Christian fundamentalist. Who, in fact, the Christians United for Israel is bigger than AIPAC. They really control the Republican Party. These are right-wing Christians who believe that modern Israel is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and we need to have a dominant Israel in order for Christ to come again. Of course, if he does, all the Jews will be condemned to eternal damnation.
I know, that's crazy.
But they wanted the Jews for Act 1, if not Act 2.
Right, they're useful.
Yeah.
And they're supposed to build the third temple.
Exactly.
Where the dome of the mount, what is it called?
Rock.
The dome of the rock.
So in other words, you have, and that's why I'm really trying to push. I try to downplay AIPAC again. Not that they aren't a factor, but when you combine that romantic liberal thing about that Israel, that a lot of older, mostly white Americans have about Israel. You have the Christian fundamentalist. You have the arms industry. You have the strategic interests, et cetera, et cetera. These all are very, very important as well. And I think we got to be really careful, because frankly, if you exaggerate Jewish power, even if you say it's Zionist power or whatever, and that really does border on anti-Semitism, because historically, people have exaggerated Jewish power, whether it be in finance or in politics or in whatever, and you got to be really careful not to do it. So again, fine to oppose AIPAC and recognize the damage they've done, but don't pretend that they are the reason the U.S. supports Israel. We would be supporting Israel anyway, because let me tell you, the U.S. has supported some pretty awful regimes, doing awful things, violating international law, slaughtering tens of thousands of people. This is not new.
Okay, let me ask you about Hamas, because how are we to move forward? Who's supposed to be talking to who? If we can even get a ceasefire, Biden's pushing supposedly for a 6-week ceasefire, and then maybe the idea is then maybe it'll continue because no one will want to go back to war. Netanyahu's like trying to stay out of jail like Trump apparently, so that's a terrible situation over there. There are protests against Netanyahu, but then people are saying, well, Hamas is, you have very far left people who are saying, hey, Hamas is just an arm of the revolution, and we need, it's kind of like they have the right to resist and do whatever they want because they've been oppressed. But then it sounds to me a lot of the time like Hamas is a extremist, religious, patriarchal organization that has thrown their enemies off of the tops of buildings and is kind of mafia, a lot of other.
Yes, they are a very reactionary force, to be sure. And they've, in addition to having an armed wing which is engaged in really heinous acts of terrorism, they've been the administrative power of the Gaza Strip, where they have suppressed women's rights, they've suppressed trade unions, they've suppressed liberals and leftists. They're pretty nasty all around.
And the Palestinians protested against them at one point.
Yes. And people who are under foreign belligerent occupation have the right to armed resistance. I don't think it's the best tactic for the Palestinians, just based on strategic levels. But again, they do have the right to armed resistance,
according to international
law. But they still have to abide by the rules of war, which means don't target civilians.
Right.
And so what happened on October 7th was a war crime, just as Israel's bombing of Gaza has been a war crime, and most Palestinians do not support Hamas. There's this crazy thing that they won the election in Gaza. They didn't win an election in Gaza. Hamas seized Gaza by force, in part because of meddling with the United States. There's a big history there, but it
was like a primary where they didn't really get the majority.
They got the majority in the parliament, but the presidency was still under the moderates. And the Bush administration pushed Fatah, the more secular nationalist moderate group, to essentially stage a coup to push Hamas out. Hamas got wind of it, tried a counter coup. When the smoke cleared, they ended up controlling Gaza, and the Fatah controlled the urban areas in the West Bank. But they've never had support, and even that 44% of the vote they got was more of a protest of the corruption of Fatah. These people did not support terrorism or hardline stuff, not to mention the fact that the vast majority of the victims of this war didn't vote for Hamas because they weren't born yet, or they were too young to vote, because this was well over 20 years ago.
And you've studied the roots of terrorism, and now we have 40,000, if not many, 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 many more killed in Gaza in the most horrific ways, right under buildings and just babies and children. We've seen so much. I keep thinking this is the root of terrorism.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the thing is that. Because basically Hamas grew from 15% support at the time of the Oslo Accords to up to 44% 12 years later, because the U.S.-led peace process was not leading to a viable Palestinian state. It was increasing the Palestinians' oppression by more colonists, by more roadblocks, and the Palestine Authority was seen as basically a puppet. They're getting a lot of foreign aid, and there's a lot of corruption.
Look, I'm going to have to cut you off because we've got 4 minutes, I think, and I want to know what you think. Who's going to talk to who? Are we talking about a one state? Are we talking about a two state? Is this beyond your pay grade?
Basically, whatever it is has to be based on the principle of equality. And as long as the United States is the sole mediator of the conflict, basically the U.S. says, we support a two-state solution, but we will not condition aid to Israel to get them to accept a two-state solution. We'll veto any United Nations attempt to impose a two-state solution. We will punish those who try to recognize Palestine, but encourage countries to unilaterally recognize Israel. We'll recognize Israel, but not Palestine, and we'll oppose even nonviolent movements like boycotts, divestment, and sanctions to force an end to the occupation. In other words, we say we're for a two-state solution, but Washington is doing everything it can to make that impossible. And that is why Hamas became the dangerous force that it is. This is why the Oslo Accords didn't go to their conclusion of a two-state solution. And that's why we have the tragedy today. It really comes down to Washington. And that's why we need to focus on U.S. policy.
Yeah, and actually, in some ways, more people are focused on this region than ever before. More people have studied the history now than ever before. More people understand the Palestinian situation probably than ever before. I want to thank you for helping out with that. Stephen Zunes, a professor at University of San Francisco, founder of the Middle Eastern Studies Department. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. And just to let you all know, I will be actually live at the DNC for the rest of the week I'm flying out tomorrow. Chris Crone, I think, will be reporting again at 5 p.m., and then I'll be reporting at 5 p.m. on Wednesday from the DNC. Try to get some interviews with some of the folks inside the conference hall and folks outside of the conference hall who are protesting on behalf of climate, on behalf of Palestinians, on behalf of all kinds of things that we still need to fix and do in this country. Just a reminder, too, we have Jess Craven on in September. Let's see, that would be the third Monday. She is a major Democratic influencer who's been tracking the Biden administration for some time. I want to talk to her about what has Biden been doing that's been good and what hasn't been so good. We just talked about something this last hour, but she knows her stuff. So join us every first and third Monday on Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. This is Amy Chen Mills herself. And I want to thank our entire team at Moment of Truth, Nyako Nyasu, Mei-Ling Obinata, Var Ramakrishnan, Todd Zimmerman, and Joyce Schendeldecker, along with the entire KSQD team on the California Central Coast. Find Amy and show updates at Amy Chen Mills on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram and Medium, where I'll be posting my updates from the Democratic National Convention, my thoughts about it, and how I think about Palestine and Israel and climate and the Democrats. We now have also a Discord channel, and you can go there and check out the articles that we share. Listen to all our past shows at your podcast streaming sites at Apple, YouTube, and Spotify. And please support us. If you're listening to us and you love us, please rate our show and leave a review and vote. Help others to vote, and go to Swing Left Santa Cruz on the internet to help with Get Out the Vote efforts across the United States. Travel to new and interesting locales and put your energy where it counts the most. We need all of us right now. Shoot us an email at amy@ksqd.org with questions or comments. And if you need to know where you can plug in to help out with the coming election, please also email us. We will plug you in. And remember, if we don't use our democracy, we lose our democracy.